Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening. My name is Stephanie Fassler, and I am the International Affairs Program Director for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council and the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center, I welcome you to this World Affairs Today and Foreign Policy Panel program. I would like to thank the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center for their generous support and partnership in allowing us to have our events at this spectacular venue. Today's panel, TPP. What does it mean for the United States and international trade? On October 6, 2015, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement became the biggest current free trade agreement in the world, surpassing the North American Free Trade Agreement. Encompassing 40% of the world's economy, the agreement is between the United States and 11 other Pacific Rim countries. The objective of the agreement is to remove trade barriers, harmonize international statutes and regulations. Advocates argue the agreement will boost the economies of all the countries involved. Others believe that the profits of the agreement will only benefit the wealthier classes in these countries while exporting jobs to competitive foreign labor markets. But what are the benefits, and what are the costs involved and potential implications for this agreement? This evening's panel will seek to address those questions. Gary Hufbauer is the Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He previously served at the United States Treasury as the Director of the International Tax Staff and Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Trade and Investment Policy. He was also the Marcus Wallenberg Professor of International Financial Diplomacy and is Deputy Director of the International Law Institute at Georgetown University. Murrary Hiebert is the Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Sumitro Chair for Southeast Asia Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Previously, he was the Senior Director for Southeast Asia at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He also worked for the Wall Street Journal's China Bureau in Beijing, Wall Street Journal Asia, and the Far Eastern Economic Review in Kuala Lumpur and Hanoi. Moderating tonight's panel is Nicole Bivens Collinson, the President of International Trade and Government Relations at Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg, PA. Ms. Collinson has represented many clients in front of Congress and has worked closely with the House Committee on Homeland Security and the Senate Committees on Finance, Commerce, Science, and Transportation. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you, Stephanie, and welcome all of you tonight. I guess it turned into a little bit of a rainy evening, so it's a good dry place to be talking about trade, one of our passions. I'm not sure everyone wants to be here, but I'm glad you all are here to join us. I think we could all say that last week was pretty monumental on a variety of levels. We had a key trade agreement was reached, at least in principle. The Speaker of the House race was kind of turned into chaos in the middle of the week. Some key USTR officials, senior officials, announced their departure. So there was a lot going on, I think, during the course of the week. But we're only going to talk about one thing, and that is going to be focusing on the TPP and what it might mean. As you know, and as you heard from Stephanie, the agreement was reached in the wee hours of the morning on Monday morning, the 5th. And it's we call it the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. There's so many acronyms, sometimes it's hard to keep straight. But that agreement is the largest agreement, or will be the largest free trade agreement. It encompasses about 40% of the world's economy. So you get an idea of the size of this and what the impact could potentially be, not only here in the United States, but internationally, and that's what we're going to focus on. It's the agreement among 12 countries. Some people call them the Dirty Dozen. Just to make sure you know who they are, it's Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, Vietnam, and the United States, of course. As Stephanie said, the objective of the overall agreement is to remove trade barriers and try to harmonize international rules and regulations. There are those who argue that the agreement's going to boost economies. There are, of all the parties that are involved. And there's others who think that, only ones who are going to benefit from this are going to be the big corporations, and that this is not going to help the little guy, and we're going to see more job losses than we are job gains. But one of the things we're trying we will look at is both the positives and the potential negatives, both sides of the argument. I think what we saw last week as well was some members of Congress, presidential candidates, associations, other NGOs came out and took stances already without even having seen the text. Some came out and said, I'm opposed to this agreement. It's not doing what we need it to do. But really, do they know we haven't seen the text? Others kind of cushioned themselves and gave a little wiggle room and said, I'm going to look at the text, and once I see the text, I'll make a decision as to how I feel about it. And then there were those who came out and started lauding the wonderful benefits of the agreement, again, before they've even seen the text. It hasn't even dried yet. So it's going to be interesting to see how this comes out. But as I said, what I'm going to let our two panelists speak about is some of the details of the agreement. And one of the things questions at least that I was getting asked a lot last week was, okay, so the agreement's done, we can start using it, right? And the answer is no. So I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about agreement has been reached. We'll discuss those terms, but what does that mean, that an agreement was reached? And basically what's going to happen is in the next few days, hopefully, the legal scrub will be done. What that means is, and I think some of my colleagues here were also served in the U.S. government and may have been negotiators, as I was a negotiator at the USTR once upon a time. And we negotiate something and we take it back and we give it to the general counsel, who then puts it into legalese. And we have to make sure that what comes out at the end of the day is actually what was agreed to across the table, because sometimes when you're putting it into language, it gets changed around a little bit. So that's the legal scrub. So that's going to be going on right now. I just read today that the USTR is going to be giving a briefing tomorrow to the cleared advisors. And there is a group, it's called ITAC, Industry Trade Advisory Committees. There's one on manufacturing, one on services, all different ITACs, individuals or company representatives who've been cleared advisors having access to secret or confidential information. So they will be briefed tomorrow on all 22 chapters of the agreement. That to me indicates that the legal text is just about done and ready to go to Congress. So goes to Congress, they send it up. What's going to happen? Is it going to pass Congress? Some have said that the administration, President Obama, is pushing to try to get the Congress to vote on the TPP as soon as April or the spring of 2016. So, but I want to take a look at the timetable that's actually we have to follow and see if that's a reasonable expectation. Because the Trade Promotion Authority Act, or TPA, as you may have heard, was passed in July, and that set in certain rules and timeframes that have to be followed when you have a free trade agreement. So what it says is 90 days before an agreement can actually be signed, the text of that has to go up to Congress for them to review. So what we're looking at right now is in maybe the end of this week, USTR, the administration, will send up the text to Congress. That starts that 90-day clock ticking. 30 days after that, they're supposed to be made available to all of us on the website, the actual text, for us to look at for another 60 days before the agreement is signed. So if we take out that time frame from now until 90 days from now, we're looking at mid-January before there could be an official signing ceremony of all of the 12 countries coming together and signing the agreement. I think during the next, those 90 days, we're going to see all the excitement that we're going to talk a little bit about tonight. It's like what's good, what's bad, who's going to benefit, who's not going to benefit, what can we expect, and the implications. So one of the things we have to think about is that after the agreement has been signed, there's still a process that we have to follow under the TPA. And that process says that before the president can send the implementing legislation, the actual bill that will eventually become law, 30 days before he sends it to Congress, he has to notify them and send up a bunch of reports. So he has to do an environmental review, he has to do an impact review, he has to give an explanation of what he plans to do, how he plans to enforce it. All of these types of reports must accompany that legislation going forward. In addition, once the agreement is signed, the ITC has 105 days to do a review of it. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to take 105 days. I understand they've already been looking at it and working on parts of it, so they may get it done much quicker than that. But if we were to count out the full 105 days, we're looking at the end of April before the ITC has finished its work. Then if you have to notify 30 or send up a bunch of reports 30 days before, now we're looking at April, May. At this point, May is when we might possibly see the implementing bill coming to the floor of the Congress. Now, there's all kinds of things that could impact that between now and then. That could be the presidential race. It could be the candidates. It could be that it might be to some people's one party's favor over the other parties to bring it up. It may be to the other party's favor to hold it back. So there's a lot of politics that are probably going to come into play as we see this going forward. So let's say the bill finally gets to Congress in May. Then another clock starts ticking. This one's a little different because this one is a legislative calendar day clock. You all might not know this, but our Congress does not work 5 days a week, every week. They might work 2 days one week, 3 days the next week, take a week off, work 4 days. So in a given month, we might get 15, maybe 20 if we're really, really lucky, legislative days. And what happens is Congress basically has 90 legislative days to consider the agreement. So the House has 60 days. Then once they're done with their 60 days, it goes to the Senate, and they have 30 days. So a total of 90 legislative days. That could be strung out all the way into 2017, but it won't, of course, because it's a different Congress, which means it could put us into a lame duck session of Congress after the presidential elections and after the full elections in November. So we could be looking at a time frame of the agreement not even being voted on by Congress until a lame duck session of Congress. So that's just to get it passed here in the United States. And then we have to talk about implementation. But before we get into some of that, one of the things that I want to also discuss is that when there's a mechanism to turn this agreement on, you may have seen recently that New Zealand released a one-pager or two-pager talking about the mechanism for the agreement to turn on. And in that agreement, it requires that the parties ready to turn on the agreement must account for 85% of the GDP represented by the agreement. The only way you can get that is if you have the United States and Japan in the mix. So it really gives those two countries more or less a veto over, or not a veto, a control over when the agreement turns on. So it's all very exciting. I don't think it's all going to happen tomorrow. It's going to give us time to think about it, time to consider it. So what we're going to do today is take a little time and try to consider what the pluses and minuses might be. And with that, I'm going to ask Gary if you'll get us started and talk about what you see coming in as a result of this and what the benefits may be.
Thanks very much, and thanks to the World Affairs Council for sponsoring this event. There's quite a difference between the opponents and the proponents. I'm a proponent, so you can get that straight right at the beginning. But the opponents basically say that if this agreement goes into effect, that's the end of the world. They don't quite say it that strongly, but you know, it's going to be pretty awful. Environment is going to go to pot, labor is going to be oppressed, big corporations are going to get rich, and we're going to lose our sovereignty. So it's a pretty dramatic anti-statement. The more responsible proponents, and I'd like to put myself in that category, say it's a modest improvement to the world. So between end of the world and modest improvement, there's kind of an imbalance between in the rhetoric. Let me now spell out what I think is the modest improvement. In terms of numbers, which are probably a little difficult to grasp, especially given orally, but our models, and the models aren't perfect, that's for sure, but our models calculate that when fully implemented, which it will be about 10 years. Even in 10 years, it will not be fully implemented because some provisions take more than that to be fully implemented. But for the most part, 10 years is a fair number. This will increase U.S. income by about $80 billion per year for the hereafter. Now, that works out, given the population that we'll have in about 10 years, in rough numbers, to about $200 a person, which is significant material, but, you know, it's not enormous. The mechanisms by which this is delivered are several. There's the comparative advantage, which Ricardo taught us about well over 2 centuries ago. But equally important, there's the productivity gains that we get by concentrating on things we make well. There are the consumer gains by a wider range of products that we have at cheaper prices. And when I go through those mechanisms, it's important to emphasize that imports are a mechanism for delivering gains. It's very popular just to talk about the export side, and we do have additional exports as a result of trade agreements, and this one will deliver additional exports. But I want to emphasize, as an economist, the import side of the equation. We gain a tremendous amount by importing products and services from the rest of the world, and we will get more if the TPP is ratified and goes into force. Apart from the gains from the TPP with the 12 countries, I think there are two very broad economic gains that have to be cited. This agreement it will be the gateway for a wider U.S. economic engagement with other Asian countries. I know right now nobody's thinking about deep engagement with China, but you know, that's a possibility, especially in the not too distant future and certainly in the lifetime of younger people, and with many countries that are not members of the TPP, such as Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, and so on. So it's a gateway, and if we don't go through this gate, we're not going to have any deeper relations with these many other Asian countries in the near term. It is also the pathway to reviving trade liberalization on a global basis, which has been pretty much frozen now for about 20 years. And that's very important. My view is that if this agreement is defeated, you could kind of say that the process of policy liberalization, which we've been on for approximately 60 years, will come to a stop, at least for a period of time, at least for 5 years and possibly longer. So those are, I think, pretty big gains. You could gild the lily by talking about the geopolitical part, but I'll skip over that. Now, in addition to the trade liberalization, and other countries will be liberalizing their trade barriers to a much greater extent than we'll be liberalizing ours, because ours are on the whole lower. There are very detailed provisions on labor and environmental standards, which are much higher than anything that exists today in trade agreements. There are provisions on intellectual property protection, which is very important for the United States. That's one of our enormous strengths, is the intellectual property of all the companies doing business. There are provisions on fair operation and disclosure for state-owned enterprises. A lot of important liberalization of services, which is a big part of our economies. And finally, it has a dispute settlement provision built into the agreement, which I think is much more robust than anything we've had in previous agreements. So it's quite a package. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Murray, you want to talk
Sure.
us through a little bit what it means internationally?
Sure. Thanks, Nicole, and thanks to the World Affairs Council for having me. So what I'll do, talk about three basic things. I will talk a little bit about the geopolitics of the TPP because it has economic as well as strategic benefits. Then I'm going to talk about the benefits and some of the challenges that are going to be faced by two countries, Vietnam and Malaysia. So as Gary said, the TPP is a gateway or a pathway for a lot of economic stuff, but it's also a key element to the Obama administration rebalance to Asia, which was launched soon after the president came into office. You know, and traditionally a lot of the U.S. engagement has been in security and political area, but the TPP really puts the economy at the center of U.S.-Asia strategy, which most Asians would like. They want the U.S. to be present. They like benefiting immensely from China, but they like to have some hedging opportunities and by the U.S. getting more engaged, helping set the rules, helping with investment and providing trade opportunities beyond what China does. It really does plant the U.S. more firmly in the region. Then I'll switch now to talking about Vietnam, which in many ways you can easily make the case that it is one of the biggest beneficiaries of the TPP. In the 10 years to 2025, Peter Petrie, who does a lot of work for the Peterson Institute, but is also an economist at Brandeis University, has done a lot of modeling, which you can easily Google and find online. But he thinks the GDP of Vietnam will grow 36% over the next 10 years beyond what it would grow anyway with the TPP. Vietnam's exports will grow 28%, and apparel and footwear, which are some of Vietnam's biggest exports, will grow 46%. And on top of that, he estimates that FDI will grow about 2% beyond what it is now. And it's really interesting. There's a lot of people are believing the narrative. Under the TPP, for Vietnam to get very low duty access to the United States, it had to agree to something called Yarn Forward, and which means that Vietnam has to source the products that it uses in the garments from a TPP country. So far, until now, almost all the apparel the inputs into apparel come from China. China, realizing it's going to lose a massive market, has already started setting up textile mills and other component factories, as have Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan. We tabulated in my office recently, and just by going through the press, you could easily find $1 billion worth of investment that Vietnam could get just in this one sector. The Vietnamese government, partially why they joined the TPP beyond these benefits in some sectors, was also to force domestic reform. One of the areas that's somewhat stuck in Vietnam is state-owned enterprises. They control 35% of the economy. And the Communist Party, the government, when they try to make reforms, run into roadblocks. So the TPP, they view as these leaders, the reformers, view as an action-forcing event that will make them open up, level the playing field for private sector in a lot of sectors. Gary mentioned the labor chapter. Vietnam has to right now in Vietnam. Basically, there's a lot of labor union activity. A lot of it may be just mostly in local workshops, but much of the labor, lots of the unions are really under the Communist Party umbrella. Under the TPP, Vietnam is going to have to implement the ILO standards. It's going to have to ratify the convention and revise a bunch of its laws. And as I understand it, not having read the agreement, but talking to people that were negotiating, Vietnam is going to have 5 years basically to implement these labor regulations, or it won't get the full benefit of market access. Vietnam will also probably face a little bit of pressure from Congress on the human rights issue. The human rights situation in Vietnam has improved phenomenally over the last 10 or 20 years, but there's still problems of occasional arrests of bloggers, journalists, and other democracy activists. And so it's quite possible that Congress will raise questions about this, even though labor is not in the TPP. Excuse me, human rights is not in the TPP. And then I'll switch to Malaysia. Malaysia is much more developed than Vietnam and stands to probably benefit much less, considerably less, but it's still, its GDP over the baseline will grow about 6% by 2025. Its exports will grow about 12%. Like Vietnam, it'll benefit hugely in the areas of apparel and textiles and also electronics. Malaysia faces two big challenges that the U.S. was really working with them on and other countries. One is government procurement. In Malaysia, it's a multi-ethnic country where the Malay population controls politics. It's the largest population grouping, but the ethnic Chinese control the economy. So in a compromise after racial riots in 1969, they devised a plan under which the Bumiputra, as they're known, or the Malay, get special privileges. And one of the areas that's carved out for them is government procurement. I don't know exactly how much has been opened up on that, but you understand from talking to negotiators that they've opened up at least part of that under the TPP negotiations. The other thing, like Vietnam, Malaysia has some very powerful state-owned enterprises. We've all heard of Petronas, one of the, fifth or sixth largest oil companies in Asia. It has some very big government-backed investment companies who really didn't want the TPP implemented. But the government is moving ahead, and I understand, although carving out some space for companies like Petronas, it will move to level the playing field. Malaysia will also face challenges on human rights. You remember probably the State Department, I think it was around July, raised Malaysia's standing in the Trafficking in Persons report. It had been in Tier 3, the lowest. And as part of Malaysia's efforts to join the TPP and prosecuting some people, they were elevated to Tier 2. There was a lot of criticism on the Hill that this was all political. The other issues on human rights are that it was around March, the opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim was thrown in prison on sodomy charges, and the government, which is now in a crisis because of investment fund known as 1MDB for short, which it's very controversial, but because of that, anybody criticizing is being nailed with sedition charges, and so Congress will undoubtedly raise some concerns. Why don't I stop there? Nicole, over to you.
Great. Thank you both. I appreciate just the overview. It gives us an idea of what some of the macro types of issues are that we're dealing with respect to the agreement. I have a couple of questions. I'm going to take the liberty of being the moderator to give them a few tough questions, and then we'll open it up to all of you and let you ask some questions as well. So one of the things I wanted to ask, I guess, both of you, in a recent Pew poll, and it was corroborated in a Gallup poll as well, both of them on trade, it showed that about 68% of Americans say trade is good for the country. 68%. Some people might be surprised by that. However, if you dive a little bit deeper and look at some of the other questions behind that, you'll see that only 34% think that free trade deals make the economy grow. Only 11% think that FTAs increase wages. And only 17% think they increase jobs. Now, the pro-trade supporters, the ones who are very much in favor of the TPP and other agreements, have argued for years that what trade agreements do is that they increase wages, they increase jobs, they boost the economy. But it seems to me, and I think these polls bear that out, that the American public isn't buying it. That's not an argument that weighs with them. So I wanted to sort of get your thoughts about what you think the difference might be whenever an average American person is looking at an agreement that's going to cover 40% of the GDP. This is way bigger than the NAFTA. We're dealing with a huge economy such as Japan, and we've got some of our politicians and the pro-trade supporters telling us it's going to increase your job, increase wages, and boost the economy, and we just haven't seen that in the past. How do you think we need to address these issues?
I'm an economist, I'm not a politician. And so let me try to tell you what economists have been saying, which I know is a very narrow group.
We just need you to speak louder.
Pardon?
We need economists to speak louder.
To speak louder. Okay, well, I'll speak louder. Okay, on the jobs question, I would say economists, or a wide group of economists, would say trade agreements neither increase nor decrease the total number of jobs in the economy. And we've looked at the data a lot. And it's very difficult to find an association between an increase or decrease in the total number of jobs in the economy. That total number is really determined by these macroeconomic aggregates, which, you know, the Federal Reserve and what's happening to monetary policy, what's happening to fiscal policy, investment, and so forth. What trade agreements do is add to the churn which occurs anyway in the job market. About 4 million people a year. We have a labor force of about 130 million. About 4 million of those people every year are involuntarily lose their jobs. Now, in terms of total movement in the labor force, it's a much larger number. It's about 25 million. But most people, they decide to move from one place to another, one job to another. But 4 million lose their jobs involuntarily because the firm closes down, whatever. Of that number, possibly as many as 500,000, and that would be a large number, about 1/8, can be attributed to the increase in trade of people losing their jobs. And about the same number find new jobs because exports go up as well as imports going up. And what we find in looking at the experience is that people associated with export-related jobs, and it's services as well as goods. Everybody thinks of the Caterpillar tractor or the Boeing airplane going out to foreign markets, and those are important. But we also sell a lot of, well, it's educational services. It's an export to have people go to University of Virginia from China, or CSIS, which is right next door to our institute. A lot of Chinese come there, or other nationalities, to all the universities. That's a huge export by the United States. Entertainment, all the television, you know, movies and so forth and so on. So I could go we have a lot of exports, and those tend to be very high-paying jobs, as well as medical equipment, Boeing and so forth are high-paying jobs. And the difference between the stability of jobs in export-related industries and the stability in import competing industries much favors export jobs, and the wages are better. So that's the payoff in the job market. Now, I realize that, as everyone in this room realizes, that we've had a long period when the average compensation, wages plus fringe benefits, of the average person in the United States has been pretty flat. It hasn't been zero. It's only increased about 0.5% or 0.75% a year for quite a number of years now. And that's a period when we've had these trade agreements. So many people jump to the conclusion that You know, it must be the trade agreements that caused the wages to flatten out. Economists generally say the big cause is there's been a technological transformation of the economy, the labor force, and everything. And that has enormous consequences. And it's come at the same time as greater trade. But most economists, and I would subscribe to this, would say that the technology impact really explains the greater part of the very slow growth in wages. But that's why people answer those polls the way they do, because, you know, that's been the experience of the last 20 years. I think there are a lot of other faults in the American economy. Infrastructure is dreadful, and we could go through the list. But I don't think trade is a big cause, but I realize that's the general impression. So I've tried to answer two parts of this very negative impression. One, that the job loss. Job churn, yes. Net job loss, no. Wages, on average, small impact from trade, perhaps, hard to detect. Big impact from technological change on a massive scale in the last 25 years, 30 years.
Murray, do you have any?
I'll just make a few brief points. I think Gary went through the economics really well. And those are more in the, I'm not sure, political sphere, I guess. I think, you know, one of the things that affects these numbers is that so much of the narrative is being driven by opponents. So you have the labor unions and others that are very critical of the trade agreements for a variety of reasons, criticizing, and you don't have anybody other than the U.S. Trade Representative, Michael Froman, speaking in favor. The president has been president for 7 years and has not yet given a trade speech, why trade matters. And then he does go give a half-hearted one at Nike. It's exactly totally the wrong place to give a speech because Nike manufactures all of its sports shoes mostly in Vietnam and through contract manufacturers, so there's not that much benefit. So I'm not quite sure why he was talking about 10,000 jobs or something coming back. But he really needs to sit down and speak against the negative narrative. But he doesn't, and you know, I guess he doesn't want to alienate the labor unions that are such strong supporters of Democrats. The other thing that I think he needs to do is describe why the other benefits, besides trade, it integrates us much more closely. I talked about the geopolitics, but at all levels, when you have a free trade agreement, you notice that countries start cooperating at all kinds of nitty-gritty areas, from agriculture to construction, regulations. There's this, everything becomes more possible if you have this integration, which I think we need to have leaders that have the guts to go out and describe what's really happening.
Thanks. I really understand that the difference between the job churn versus the job loss, and that's something that I've gotten in many discussions about with different individuals, both for and against the trade position. And one of the things that, you know, I heard you both say is that the unions or the voices who are against the trade agreements themselves or against opening additional markets seem to be the loudest voices. And those are the ones that are being heard versus economists or other voices who have studied the data, seen the actual facts, and are speaking from the facts of a knowledge basis. What do you think contributes to this? Because many of the large corporations, for example, Nike, or different companies that I work with in my everyday business, they have been able to actually expand their workforce and expand their business, and more importantly, their market access into other markets through the free trade agreements. But what do you think is the problem with the disconnect between the companies and the businesses, or maybe the suits at the top versus the workers at the bottom? What do you think could be contributing to this?
Well, I've been very critical of the business community for literally decades on the very point you raised, Nicole. Most business firms are quite timid in terms of the political battles that we go through, including this one. And they do not want to go out and be very prominent in arguing for the agreement and talk about the benefits, because they fear that if they do that, they will be targeted adversely in terms of selling products or maybe rile up some of their labor unions or whatever. And so I'll give just one little anecdote from literally more than 2 decades ago, but I was on a board of a consumers group which was pro-trade, and we went out and talked to the big retailers of the day, which included Walmart at that time, and I don't think Target was very big at the time, but Kmart and others. And why don't you talk more about the low prices in your store on account of your imports? Well, what they said is, if we do that, we will be targeted, boycotted by our rivals who will say all our products are made in America. So that was that group. That was 20 years ago, but it was quite an arresting kind of response that we got. There are a few firms which actually tell their employees when they are producing for the export market. Caterpillar is most conspicuous in this. In their assembly line, they actually say, got some screen or something that says the products being made today are going to be shipped to Brazil or wherever the place may be. But that's quite unusual. So if the business firms don't get out and tell the story better, kind of shame on them. And if they lose the political battle, they can blame themselves for it. Now, in addition to these very pinnacle business firms, that the name brands I'm talking about, they have literally thousands of suppliers. Boeing claims it has 10,000 suppliers. And I guess, as everyone in this room knows, and this audience knows, Boeing probably sells well over half its airplanes abroad. Does Boeing go out and tell its suppliers, which are much smaller companies on average, you're really selling to the export market and this is why you have a job and so forth and so on? No, they don't. Well, they don't want to get into the fray. So, as you said, Nicole, at the beginning, it is somewhat discouraging that the clear beneficiaries in terms of just exports, which is not the only benefit, but it's the most visible one, are so silent and waiting for somebody else to step up and sell their case.
Thank you. One word that you mentioned, Gary, was transparent. And there's a couple of generations of people who are used to sharing everything that they are doing, as well as having you share everything that you're doing with them. And so, I'm just wondering how much this sort of attitude has influenced the dialogue about the transparency and how you both feel the transparency has been, and if you noticed any appreciable difference in this administration and its negotiation of an FTA vice the negotiation by previous administrations.
Well, I was a trade negotiator decades ago, and it was far more secret then than it is now. If anything, it's much more open now. The leaks are greater, the disclosure is greater. However, the appetite for disclosure has gone even faster than the extent of disclosure. So it's lagging. And you mentioned all the social media and so forth, WikiLeaks, you could mention that, and so on and so forth, so that the degree of secrecy is much less, but it still irritates people who want to follow the agreement and would like to be in the room when the agreement is being negotiated. And then that's where the nub comes. And so I want to just give the analogy to a couple other branches of government. When the Supreme Court, this is an extreme example, but when the Supreme Court justices meet, there's nobody else there but the justices, not even the clerks. And there's no recording that you ever get. Maybe sometime, much later in memoirs, they tell you what happened there. I mean, but there are pretty important things that are decided when those justices meet. You know it when you read the decision. So that's one area. And then you think about it, well, what if it were more transparent? Well, I think it'd be much more difficult for them to reach a decision. Okay, let's come to the political bodies. When they, just recently you mentioned at the outset, Nicole, about the Republicans. Well, when the Republicans go into caucus, they close the doors. Now you get some leaks afterwards, but they close the doors while those important decisions are being made. Conference committees, the same thing. So just how open can it be, and you can still get agreement, because once you get the light, if you get instant reporting, it does make it harder for the negotiators to change their position, because then they're seen to be weak. But all these agreements are compromise. So there's got to be a better balance than we had this time. You're right, it was quite irritating, created a lot of resentment, not only by the public, but also even by congressmen, even quite senior congressmen. So we didn't get the balance right. Where the balance is, that remains to be seen.
Yeah, I agree with you, Gary, that this was much more transparent. I mean, USTR was up briefing the Hill a lot. I'm not quite sure on the last point that you made, Gary, why some congressmen feel they didn't get enough information. I don't know if there was concern that the Congress, which is pretty famous for leaking a lot of stuff, might actually do that. And so I don't know, but NGOs and Congress were certainly briefed a lot more than had happened in the past. The other point I would make is, this is sort of a game plan, and when you play poker with your cronies, or the Washington Redskins play football yesterday, or whatever, or Sunday, you don't, put your playbook out there, and then when you have not only one party like I don't know, Australia or Singapore, you suddenly have 11 parties where all the people there are clamoring for information. It results in a lot of calls for greater transparency, but I really don't know how you do it and get an agreement, negotiated. Yeah,
if I could just supplement very briefly, following the last days down in Atlanta, the senior members of the Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee, all four of them complained about, inadequate consultation. What they meant, and we know what Senator Hatch meant, that's the most obvious. He wanted 12 years of data exclusivity for drugs. I could go into explain that, but that's what he wanted, 12 years. And Froman compromised at 5 years. And Hatch was very unhappy about that. And what his complaint was not so much secrecy, but that he wasn't able to change the position that Froman reached. There were others who were quite unhappy that we did not get more access to the Canadian dairy market. And we didn't get very much, we got a little. And then there are the rice people. I mean, it's hard to imagine that the U.S. is a big rice exporter, but we export some. And they were unhappy they did not get more access to the Japanese rice market, and I'll just name one other. And they all had their spokesman. They tacked it onto the transparency issue, but the real issue was they wanted to be right next to the negotiator. They actually wanted to negotiate the issue. Tobacco people, they were unhappy to be carved out of the investor-state dispute settlement. Well, yeah, people are unhappy because the compromise doesn't always go the way they want in these trade agreements.
Yeah, I think the Rolling Stones did a song that kind of applies to this situation, right? You can't always get what you want.
Hard to believe.
They knew it back then. With that, I'm going to take a break and see if there's any members of the audience who would like to ask our panelists a question. And if so, we have a microphone just over here.
I don't think anyone would disagree that free trade agreements are generally good for the economy as a whole, increasing demand, increasing efficiency, and so forth. But what would you say to those in the industries that face job losses and so forth? What would you say to their disagreement to the trade agreement?
Okay, I have two answers. None of them are very satisfactory. One, in this economy, we have a help yourself philosophy. We do much less for displaced workers than I think any other advanced country. Any other advanced country, so I'm talking about Europe and Canada, Australia, Japan, which I think is quite regrettable. And, you know, there was a big battle over trade adjustment assistance in the same time that Trade Promotion Authority was enacted last year. We finally did get a little trade adjustment assistance, and when I say a little, it is tiny. It's under $1 billion a year in an economy of our size, and we calculate that I gave you the number, the annual benefits, we think the economy will be, when it's fully phased in, $80 billion. Our trade adjustment assistance are nowhere near dealing with the downside of the job churn. So that's regrettable, and the fact that it happens, you know, it doesn't make anybody happy on the other side of the debate because, you know, we're not going to do very much in this country. The second thing is that, fortunately, and the second answer is that, fortunately, we have a fairly mobile economy in terms of the labor force relative to many other countries. So people can move from place to place and job to job, and many people can move, but not everyone. And especially when you've got two people in the household working and they have a house in an area where property prices have gone down, mobility is pretty limited. So those people are, in fact, losers. And we've done some calculations on these losers, and we would say that on average, those who lose their jobs on account of a trade agreement, which is, again, it's a small fraction of people who lose their jobs annually in our economy, and we don't help any of the others as well, they take about a 20% job, on average, 20% pay cut, compensation cut. So that's the downside of of a dynamic economy right there.
I was hoping that you could elaborate a little bit further on the relationship with China that will develop out of the TPP. Both the challenges this will present for U.S.-China relations and also some of the opportunities.
One thing we didn't, Gary and I didn't say before about China is that, or add about the TPP, is that the TPP is, all the members are members of APEC, the 21 economies of the Asia-Pacific Economic Community. The goal is eventually to move to include all the rest of the countries, which is the Free Trade Area of the Asia-Pacific, or FTAP for short. And it was interesting when China hosted APEC last year, they launched an initiative to encourage countries to do studies about what it would mean to move toward an FTAP. So China, that there is that whole dynamic where the U.S. and China and other APEC countries have already thought about this. The one area where the U.S. and China are now negotiating is a bilateral investment treaty, which will govern investment principles and provide guarantees, and it's moving really slowly. They've been going at this since the end of the Bush administration. Then it was paused for a while the Obama administration figured out what it wanted to see in the so-called BIT. But obviously, there are just there's an unending list of potential opportunities. If it was easier for U.S. companies to invest, China has a lot of restrictions. local content requirements, sharing of basic information about technology, which really makes it difficult for U.S. companies to do a high quality business. And then China is also really worried, where they keep getting restricted from investing in certain areas that they think they should be allowed to under government regulations. There is a review process if China gets involved in sensitive areas which restrict Chinese investment. And so, I mean, ultimately, you could really, the sky's the limit in areas where the two countries have challenges and where they have potential opportunities. We've talked a lot about intellectual property rights, a huge problem in China. So, yes, if the U.S. and China could pull it off, it would be hugely beneficial, probably to both, I would guess, to both sides.
Thank you.
We'll take one last question.
My question is, we talked a little bit about workers today and what's going to happen or in the near future, but what I'm thinking about is our future generations. If we have all these opportunities coming up and it'll take 10 years for the full TPP to come into effect, what can we do to prepare our next generation of workers, our students that are in school today? What should we be doing to prepare them for the future?
Can I pontificate for a moment? I'm a big advocate of trying to work with the youth and get them educated for the future, and I have 2 teenagers, so I have a vested interest in this. And one of the things that I've seen, the change in the school and the education, for example, is they don't learn handwriting anymore. My kids never had a handwriting class. They don't know how to do cursive letters. They have trouble reading when I write to them in cursive, which is all that I do. They also don't know how to keyboard. And they haven't even taught them how to keyboard because there's going to be no need as they go into the future, because they'll be able to speak what they need to have written in any types of text. And I think that trying to figure out exactly what we need to train or what areas in which we need to train our younger generation are going to be exceedingly difficult, because when you think about where we are today from 10 years ago, it has made incredible changes, very much different from what I think people had anticipated, outside of needing healthcare providers for all of us getting old up here. That other than that, I mean, what are the next jobs going to be? And when you're going into these new markets, how are they going to develop? And I think that one of the things is looking at our education system and looking at the United States, we are one of the most innovative, and we do allow our young people the ability to think outside the box. We don't teach by rote. The Japanese teach by rote. The Chinese teach by rote. We allow free thinking. We allow this. And I think that that's the area where if we encourage that and really develop that, and not teach them just an answer to a problem, but how to get to the answer of a problem, we're going to be able to continue to succeed. And that's my own personal opinion.
Please join me in thanking our panelists and moderator.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.